Won't you welcome Samuel?
You know, I have been called so many things. David, don't even go there. So I want somebody to keep an eye on the General Secretary for me. Would you please, Kevin? So I'm calling a DE to keep an eye on the General Secretary. So,
I'll behave myself.
yes, thank you, Brother David. It is truly an honor to be here tonight to be able to share with you a little bit about some of the crazy things that I am involved with. At the same time, I don't see myself sharing here as an expert, but I'm sharing part of a story that it is our story. And I mean our story because all that I'm sharing here tonight wouldn't have been possible if you and every one of you, that if I begin to go name after each other, it will be, I know I'll get myself in trouble if I start naming names, because I'll miss some names. But you all have played a part, one way or the other, in helping shape me, in helping build in me the culture of what I have found myself doing. And so I titled my talk this evening, Change the Culture, Change the World. I'll give a little bit of an intro about who am I. And because sometimes, and I don't want to sound as like talking to a district, but I'm talking to the church, into church planting. Sometimes the church call leadership. And you call a leader just because you have a faith that God has really called them. And you just take a deep step of faith without really knowing what is the makeup, what is the story, where do they come from? And I'm not talking about physical location here. I'm talking about spiritual journey. What is it that has helped them? What is it that has shaped them? And what is it that has informed their understanding of Scripture? And how are they living out what had really shaped them, what I call the formed theology and the lived theology. And for me, sometimes my formed and lived theology are in conflict with one another. I don't know about you, but mine is always in conflict. One moment, the formed theology wants to stick its head out, and another moment, the lived theology wants to stick its head out and overshadow the formed theology. So I kind of find myself being a true brethren in the sense that there's constant tension between our Anabaptist and Pietist group. And okay, so I was born in Nigeria. I grew up in just a conventional evangelical, but not an evangelical in an American politics. Let me set that straight. I grew up in an evangelical church, not an American evangelical, because an American evangelical is being politicized. And brethren, whether we like it or not, we have an evangelical DNA in us. And I'm not talking about American politics evangelical. Go back in our history, study out who we are and whose we are. It's been formed by a passion to communicate the gospel of the kingdom. And so what makes us evangelicals? So I was raised in a regular conventional evangelical church in Nigeria, and I come to faith in my final year of college. I won't bore you up with my whole testimony or my story of my conversion. I had a spiritual encounter that I know that people around me, after they've seen me a few weeks later, they said, if truly Jesus is real, we can tell Jesus is at work in the life of this renegade. If God can change this one, God can change anyone. So, and in my final year of college, this is a little bit of background that will help you. My father, I come from a big family, and my father had this idea of, let me dish out vocations for all of the children. And when it come to my turn, my father said, you are going to become the attorney. And I flipped the bird on him. I said, you can be the attorney, but I'm not. I'll become a social worker. But you know, when you read the story of Joseph, whose brothers decided to pitch him to Pharaoh, pitch him, sell him, and they think they're doing themselves a good favor. But I thought I was doing myself a good favor by flipping the bird on my parents to become a social worker. But in the midst of that, God knew. And I got really swept into inner city ministry after college. If I was an attorney, there was no connection to inner city ministry and the call to be in ministry. This was about 25 years ago. And I've been on that journey. And that journey had taken me from Nigeria all the way through, without listing all the countries, through sub-Saharan Africa, doing all kinds of ministry. And now I'm here. And I've just realized a couple of weeks back that actually the longest place I have lived outside the country of my birth is Rockford, Illinois. Wow. I don't know if that's a good thing yet. But Rockford has really become home for me and my family. I'm married with 3 daughters, 14, 12, and 11. The 14 and the 12-year-old turns 15 and 13 next week. And I am a graduate of Bethany Seminary, and not only Bethany Seminary, I am a graduate of George Fox Theological Seminary, and I just graduated with my Doctor of Ministry in Semiotics and Future Studies. So some of you might be wondering, what is that? Simple. Semiotics is meaning making out of culture. How do you make meaning of the culture that we are in? And how do you help the church navigate this culture? So you can see the theme and the thread running through change the culture, change the world. So it's sort of my dissertation that I'm trying to present, a snapshot of my dissertation that I'm presenting to you here. So what does that really mean? I'm going to read from scriptures, a little bit from Matthew, Psalms, and from Luke chapter 2. Luke 24 and from Psalms 2. In Psalms 2, the psalmist asks, "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possessions." Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance. And we're not talking about physical land. Ethne, nations, is people group, is tribes. Fast forward to Revelation. "And lo, I stand, behold, and a nation, a great multitude of people, of language." So when you correlate it to this psalm, the psalmist is saying, "Ask of me, and I will make all the tribes of the earth your inheritance, and the ends of the earth," the Great Commission. "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, I am with you." So going out to the ends of the earth, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, North Africa, South America, you name it, we are called to ask God to give us those nations. And I don't know about you. I'm passionate about the fact that I know I have a God that has promised that if I ask, pray for those people. And when I mean those people, I don't mean it in any put down way. Pray for those nations, for the gospel to be able to shine the light in those nations. And then a little bit into Luke chapter 24. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubt rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you can see I have." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything for me here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it, ate it in their presence. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that it's written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scripture. And he told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead, and on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sin will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses to these things. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. Again, Jesus promising that the gospel must be preached to all the nations of the earth. And I have this background there to remind us that when we think about the gospel, we shouldn't be thinking about just North America. But at the same time, we can't ignore North America and only think about the nations of the earth. The tendency is for us to think about mission from a very sending missionaries point of view. But then we forget the essence of that there is a culture that needs to be changed. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of some research that I found out in our own cultural history. How brethren have been a people that have transformed their own culture. Although these passages of scriptures are very familiar to us, but the tendency is we gloss over the resurrection story. I know just a couple of weeks back we spent resurrection, and this coming next tomorrow is Pentecost Sunday. We read the resurrection story, and it's like one good old story, and we come back to it next Easter. But there's so much depth to it that we need to unpack. I want to bring your attention to the power of the gospel that is able to transform cultures. That is not only able to transform culture, but it is able to transform a whole nation and then the world. So imagine with me in the passage that we read in Luke, this band of fearing disciples that have just the other day, they were with Jesus, and then Jesus was crucified, and Jesus had died, and then he's buried. And they're all hugged up in one room, just wondering what next. They are afraid of the Roman Empire, afraid of all that is happening. I want us to leave that in the parking lot for now. I'll come back to you. I'll come back to the Easter experience. So I hope that through this presentation, I will hope that we will get to the place that how do I know when to adapt to culture and when to resist culture? How might I change the status quo without being changed by it? And when shall I challenge the status quo of Christianity itself? How should I challenge the status quo of Christianity itself? And I'm not talking about cultural Christianity. There is an American cultural Christianity, and there is a Christian culture, but there is a real Christianity that Christ calls us to follow Jesus. Not the one we make up according to our own traditions, but that which was experienced at the Resurrection Sunday, that which we continue to experience. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a quote from our founding fathers. Our founding fathers are radical pietists. Radical pietists, this is from Schwarzenegger Brethren, were molded by the radical pietist understanding of spirituality and the Christian life and the Anabaptist understanding of the church. This is our story. And if this is our story and this is our foundation, I want to ask you the question, what do you think is molding us today? Are we molded by our understanding of spirituality and Anabaptism? Or are we molded by the culture? This is a question that we all can personally ask ourselves, and I hope that as we listen to ourselves, we will be able to understand who is molding us or what culture is molding you as an individual. Because when you realize the culture that is molding you as an individual, it helps you to be able to decide, will you allow that culture that is molding you as an individual, or will you allow the counterculture to mold you? Our early Anabaptists and Pietists, the Schwarzenegger Brethren, understood what they wanted to mold them. But a little bit about culture. Humans are creators of culture just like the animal kingdom. Animal kingdom too have a culture. But a little bit about the ant culture. What does the ant and human culture have in common? The ant culture, although it can be very frustrating when an ant creeps into your home or creeps somewhere where you don't want it to be. I've experienced that. If you've grown up in Nigeria, you will find out that you will be in your room and there will be some ants creeping, crawling around when you don't really expect them. And so the ant culture is sort of really formed in such a way that the ants really know how to organize themselves. They have the queen mother whose business is just to produce babies. And they have all the male ants whose job is to go fend for food. And when they fend for food, all they do is take care of their colony. They get the food, the queen mother produces babies to produce more colonies. And then the male ants just all pass away. But what is the difference between the ant culture and the human culture? The human culture in itself, it's unique. We create cultures as we live every day. We create cultures because of the uniqueness of the human culture is the repertoire of our activities and our adaptation to the changing world and to the changing environment. Let me take this a little bit, the human repertoire of the culture. When you begin to pray, I heard it was said this morning or this afternoon by our brother Nate Polson, when you have a culture of a church planter, what happened is you don't have a culture all of a sudden because you've done something 3 times. It becomes a culture of the church. We've never done it this way. Maybe I'm talking to myself here. Because we create our own culture through repertoires. While it is true that these cultures are durable in itself, culture, according to Derrida, involves a dialectic between what was and what is becoming, between the known patterns and their contradiction. What that simply says is culture is known by the dialectic existence of both what is known and what it is becoming. So we create cultures. We can create a culture of violence, or we can create a culture of peace. We can create a culture of conflict transformation, or we can create a culture that is anti-conflict, that creates conflict itself. I'm sorry for those double negative. Or sometimes the church is really good at creating a culture that creates rooms for the breeding of conflict. What Derrida is saying here is culture exists in a tension. And so unless we understand that culture exists in a tension, we will find ourselves that kind of hanging in one end of the balance of the tension. But the question is, it's not about creating cultures, it's to understand the culture that we live in. What is the pervasive culture of today? What is the kind of language, if you and I are to make any difference in our generation, if we are to make a difference in the 21st century in North America, if we are to make a difference even in the world, in the kind of violent culture we live in, we need to understand how does the culture speak today? Maybe let me pause this question. Do you know how the culture speaks today? The culture we live in today speaks in images and soundtrack. The culture does not speak just with words or actions. When you watch a TV, I think I've just messed myself up by going to school. Because I watch any program that I watch on TV or on YouTube or anything, I break it down into what is the underlying culture shift here? What is the underlying culture change? What does the writer, what does the producer of this movie, what are they trying to communicate? Even though I know in one of my past many lives, I own a movie production business. And not as a producer. I'm not a good producer, but I own the financial edge of the movie producing business. I own a business in Cape Town before I sold it. And as a business investor, I can tell the intent, the worldview of the movie producer. But it has gone a little bit really far today in terms of how culture is speaking. Culture speaks in images, language, and sounds. So I'm going to play you a short commercial without telling you what it is. And I hope you're able to follow this commercial and unpack it for yourself. It's just about 45 seconds. There is no greater act of hospitality than to embrace a stranger as one's own. It is in our nature. This is a commercial for a hotel. The very act of hospitality that is displayed in the soundtrack, the very act of hospitality that is displayed in the imagery, shows that hospitality in Shangri-La, in Singapore, is so great that even in the midst of your pain, we will be there for you. Even when the condition is unbearable, we will be there for you. In today's culture, the truth is communicated in narrative form, not in a bunch of propositions. Out with the propositions. In with the story. And guess what? We have a story to tell. We have got a story to tell. We can tell the story of our faith. We can tell the story of our forefathers. We can tell the story of what God has done for us. We can tell the story of experiencing the power and the move and and what God has done in our life. I don't have to go tell anybody and give them ideas of why they should believe in the gospel. But I can tell them what the gospel means to me. Yes. And when I tell them what that means to me, sisters and brothers, I am sharing the gospel with them by telling a story. Amen. I will say our culture speaks in metaphor, a form of story metaphor. A metaphor is it's tell a story with a metaphor. But the problem then is, I'm sorry. Yes. The fault line, the problem is we always imagine that we cannot be able to change culture. We have this idea that, we are just tiny little bit of brethren folks. Remember, we're just under 200,000, just a little over 100,000 people. We cannot change the culture. We don't have much of an impetus to change the culture. Friends, I have good news for you. A band of 11 folks hid in that room, and they were hiding from all the clouds of the Roman Empire. And there's more than 11 of us here. And we're not even hiding from the American Empire. We're not hiding from anybody. We are free to be able to tell the story of what God has done to us. Amen. And when we tell that story, we shape the culture. But the idea is, the fault line that we often imagine that we cannot change the culture is, we have this idea that we are hoping for a change in the world, that some great leader will arise and he will sweep the empire and the change will happen. Tell me how that's working for us in our today's politics. The second fault line is we kind of feel a lack of engagement in the present culture. We want to save an old culture that is not speaking to today's culture. We want to take a round peg and fit it in a square hole. And we imagine that if we only push that round peg harder, it will fit. Or we take the square peg and try to fit it in a round hole. If we can only push harder, because the old culture is good old culture, that if we can only preserve it, we will get it to change the narrative. Friends, we have an opportunity to change the culture, thereby change the world. But what happened between the third aspect of being our inability, the fault line is a state of hopelessness. Oh, this is getting too big. We will just give up and put up our hands and say, okay, God, we need a rescue. I don't think we need a rescue. God has put you as the rescue. And I don't mean this in any facetious way, but we have a God that has promised that I will never leave you nor forsake you. If that is the promise that Jesus gave those disciples, and we know, who said it this afternoon, that, I think it's either, I can't remember. The church in Antioch, the church that Paul founded, is no longer there. It's all gone. But the gospel continues into this century. So it's about time that we begin to reimagine how we can, instead of going to a place of hopelessness, is to begin to reimagine how we can re-engage. So what is it that happened between, you remember I read for you from the book of Luke, what happened between that morning, that evening that Jesus showed up in the disciples? I call it the Easter effect. And the Easter effect is that the disciples kept going back to that experiential story of seeing Jesus. They kept going back to that experience of knowing that this same Jesus that we saw crucified on Friday, this same Jesus that even these women said to us they saw him. This same Jesus that even Peter said he saw him. And then the Bible says he appeared to the 12, to the women, and then to the 12. And then he appeared to the multitude. This same Jesus had reawakened something in these disciples. And the Easter effect kicked in. My invitation to us, as you listen, is that we need an Easter effect every day in our lives. Not only on Good Friday, and every Good Friday, I really do love my city. We do Good Friday service where we have 7 words of Christ and they get all 7 speakers. This year I was privileged to be one of those 7 speakers, and then I was sandwiched right in between the Baptists. They put 3 Baptists and then smack me in the middle and another 3 Baptists. And the reason is so that the first 3 Baptists will preach the salvation message that I get saved. If not, if the last 3 will get me saved somehow. That's my own interpretation. So how did it happen that a ragtag group of nobodies formed themselves to become a dominant force in a culture that is so anti-Christendom or Christianity? How can a group of just ragtag guys that are hiding, one moment we hear them hiding in the corner, but trying to really, probably there was no, imagine just being in a room with probably no light because they're afraid of what the Roman soldiers are going to do to them. Remember, just before the crucifixion, Peter said, I never know this guy. He was shaking in his pants with that little girl said to him, you are one of them. And all the disciples had fled. And even at the cross, none of them could be bold enough to even go right to the foot of the cross except those poor old women, those ladies. God bless women and their persistence. The Jesus movement that began from the margins of the 1st century Palestine or the Roman Empire had gone to become a dominant force. That Constantine, when he took over the empire, Constantine realized that I think if I can get these guys on my side, because he had experienced the power of a resurrection, because he had seen those bunch of nobodies in society, now they have become the center of society in the sense that their influence continued to sweep and win more people to the kingdom. And Constantine all of a sudden realized, let me make some political move here. Because if I make the good political move, it will benefit my empire and it will benefit my pocket. Let me give them a seat in the seat of affairs. Doesn't that sound like some experiences that we're experiencing? And when we forget the power of the Easter effect, we are not able to change society. What is it about our tradition, our early brethren history, that really get the idea behind this Easter effect? I'm not going to take time but look at this. Look at just this simple brethren and the cultural transformation. And all of this, most of it comes from brethren and society. Our brethren culture, our history tells us that our people were a people that transformed their own society. So what about us? What is holding you back? What is holding us back? I'll tell you a little bit of my own personal story of how I envision changing or being a part of changing a culture in my own community. Because I will sound very hypocritical here to get up and talk to you about changing culture, changing the world, and I'm not practicing what I preach. I am convinced that I cannot get up and talk about, give you all this great thesis, great research about how to change culture without actually putting it into practice. So in my own context, I looked at, I'm only going to give you one line of story and then we will wrap up and I will give room for question and answer. In my own context, I decided to look at how can I change the police militarized community? How can I change the police culture in my city? For those of you that are from the Rockford region, you can tell by reading our local newspaper. How can the church be involved in changing the police culture? This is a very visible culture that everybody sees. You just need to watch the news. It's not going to be almost like there's a circle of news that every 7 days, some black man or black woman gets shot by white police officers. Or they get kicked out of Starbucks. Or they get kicked out of their own dorm room at Yale University because they don't belong there. And so how do we change? So my concept is, how can I help change the culture of my own police department? The story all began for me, I'm not going to retell the story here, when 2 white police officers shot a teenager in the basement of a black church, and my city went in riot. And when all the cameras are all long gone, when CNN is gone, when MSNBC is gone, at the end of the day, there is the churches in the community still stays. What is our church doing to address and change the culture of our community, thereby change the culture of the world? So in my own context, after the incident, I said, as a peace church, what am I going to do? I got involved right in the midst of it. And in the last nine years, I have helped my community, my police department, move from one central controlling headquarters to 3 different geographic police districts. And this did not happen because I sat in my high tower as a pastor and sent emails or make phone calls or call congressmen. And I know those work. I'm not against calling congressmen. But when you hit the street running, as church planters, as pastors in an existing church, I think there is one way you can renew your church is get involved in your community. Because renewal in your church, when you want to see church growth or make an impact in your community, it does not come from sitting in the high tower of a high steeple church and sending emails. That's just a little bit. When you get involved in the nitty-gritty day-to-day running of your community, you will see the change that you long for. You're not only longing for it, you are being changed in the process. So our police department, like I said, went from 1 police district to having 3 police stations. And these 3 police stations, we worked it in such a way that it is becoming community centers. Can you imagine a police department becoming a community center? It is real. You can take a trip to Rockford, and I'll give you a tour of our police districts. And you just need to read the local newspaper. They'll tell you all the events that are happening at the different police districts. And our police districts have become an art gallery where kids from the minority community can go to the police department to view their art as an art gallery. Can you imagine that? So we were able to change our militarized police culture into a community policing culture. A couple of months back, we had Loyola University did a social science research, and they weren't able to interview. They interviewed about 280 people across the city, white and black, rich and poor, across the real divide. 9 out of every 10 people in the city of Rockford said they really love the police department. How is that possible in this media-savvy culture? It is possible when it is grassroots driven. It is possible when it's community owned. And I'm following up with my own research as part of something that I'm doing that it's going to come sometime down the road. I am scheduling an interview of over 2,000 residents of the city of Rockford to really find out, is community policing working? And if it is, what is the impact that you want to see? So we went from 1 community, 1 police headquarters to geographic. We went from having neighborhood strong houses, having 5 different homes in the neighborhood across the city, where it is a community center in a way, but it's a neighborhood home where kids in that neighborhood can come in there to do their homework in the evening. Tell me about changing culture. And then we went from that to having a partnership to create what we call a mobile tech lab and a mobile art lab. This became a partnership between my church, the city of Rockford, the Rockford Police Department, and what are we doing? Educating the community on nonviolence, conflict transformation, and peacemaking. And we're doing it. We're not only waiting for the kids to come out to learn computer coding and programming, but we take the mobile tech lab and the mobile art lab to the community so the kids can experience what it means to imagine a hopeful future. We're changing the culture of our community. We're not only changing the culture of our community from top down, but we're changing the culture of our community in the middle. One of the things that I have done, which we have done as a community, is to be able to imagine how can we begin to sow in the next generation the idea of what peace can look like. And so we decided to intersect a middle school. So last year during our International Peace Day, we decided to record, in our mobile tech lab, we decided to record 600 school kids based on a song that I contracted one of the ladies in the a musician to write a song for me so that we can produce it as our own. It's about what we got to share. It's about we might come from different cultures, from different backgrounds, but we have one common humanity. So I'll play this video for you as one of the recording that we did from our mobile tech lab.
There is a choice, always a choice. We choose civility. We are one shape, so many-sided. We differ, but we're united. More than just get along. Together we get it right. What we got, we get.
When you go to our school district of over 31,000 students, you hear this song played in the school hall. All the 4th and the 5th graders connect with this song. This is a public school. This is not a Christian city. It's a public school that the church is defining what our future look like. The question that I want to leave with you this evening, the question that I want to leave with you is, what are some ways that God might be calling you to change the culture of your community? Because I am aware that change does not begin from top down, from outside. Change, have you watched the movie Waiting for Superman? Change does not come from some superheroes. We are a superhero society. That is why all the superhero movies outsell themselves even before they are released. We are a superhero society, but the superhero that lies within you needs to be awakened. Each and every one of us have a superhero story that we can change the culture. And when we get engaged in changing the culture, we will see the result. Our world will be changed. So my invitation to you is, friends, it's all up to you. It's in your hands. It's in my hands. That we can be the change that we long for. God bless you.
Amen.
Thank you, Brother Samuel, and for the challenging presentation and also the reflective thoughts of how we can change our communities. Change, change, change. So let's change it.